just bought a new ultrasound machine, or maybe you've inherited one, but you've got absolutely no idea what to do with it, how to optimize your image, and how to get the best out of the images that you're actually seeing. Fortunately, no matter what machine you've got, the ultrasound basics between each machine are generally the same. So the next few slides are going to talk you through how to optimize your machine to get the best image possible for cattle pregnancy testing. So ultrasound works exactly how it sounds like. Ultrasound. It's a generation of an image via a high-frequency sound emission. Your transducer emits these high-frequency ultrasound waves. These reflect back off anatomical structures and are received back by their transducer into electrical pulses to create an image on that screen. Now, the reflection of this sound differs between different tissues, and this generally comes down to tissue density. Now, this is great in the context of pregnancy because there are lots of different tissue types going on, which allows us to distinguish between maternal and fetal structures. So let's have a look at an ultrasound image. This is an image of a sheep pregnancy, but many of the components are going to be the same, except for the fact that this is a twin pregnancy. So we're hoping there's not going to be too many of those in cattle. Fluid does not reflect sound well, but it does transmit sound well. So the basis of most of your images is that your fluid should be black. By comparison, we've got our fetal skulls here. They have much more distinct white outer layers because of that dense bone structure, which is reflecting that sound to have a much more solid image. We've also got some cotyledons here, or placentomes. These are placental tissues and often pictured in grey because they're a median density between fluid and bone and therefore transmitting the sound to a different degree. We've got an example here of looking for the fetal heartbeat. This is a great example of looking into the fetal abdomen and looking at all different tissue types to see the example of how sound is transmitted and how this may look on your ultrasound image. This overall picture is the middle of the fetal abdomen. We can see the liver, and on the left-hand side, the heartbeat. On the upper part of the image, we can see these white structures, which are the bone or rib cage, outlining that abdomen. The fetal liver is a fairly consistent grey structure interspersed with small black circles, which are vessels. Over here, as the scanner moves through the image, we can see that fetal heartbeat marked by the outline of the heart and fluid-filled chambers. This is another example of scanning through a pregnancy. In this case, the scanner is looking to see if there's more than one pregnancy or more than one fetus. To the right-hand side of the image, you can see the fetal skull, identifiable because of the high level of reflection and high white density of that bone outlining the skull. On the other side of the image, we can see the end of the other uterine horn containing a cotyledon or placenta. We can tell from the grey of this cotyledon that it's not another fetal skull, and in this case, there is only one pregnancy. So what are we actually looking at when we're scanning cattle? If we're going transrectal, that probe is facing downwards into the uterus and fetus, scanning through potentially different fetal structures. It's important to remember that when you're scanning, you're getting a cross-section of the image. A useful way to do this, if possible, is to use your scanner on uteri from the abattoir. Placing the scanner in one direction will give you a cross-section of the uterine body and uterine horns. Turning the scanner will give you another cross-section, so looking through the lumen or the middle of that structure. When considering purchasing an ultrasound machine, or when seeing how to work the one you've got, it's important to remember that not all probes are equal. Some of the most commonly used probe types are curvilinear probes. These are essentially a compromise between a straight linear probe and a sector probe, and they're very popular for cattle pregnancy testing. This compromise essentially allows for a reasonable field of view whilst also maintaining image quality. They're often used in the context of determining when cattle are pregnant or not, as well as the stage of pregnancy. By comparison, linear probes have excellent clarity, great image quality, but a much smaller field of view. They're typically used in the context of looking at ovarian activity and follicles, more in the context of targeted breeding programs and embryo transfers, but not as particularly useful for pregnancy scanning. Also available on the market are sector probes. You typically don't have as good an image from these probe types, but you do have a bigger field of view. You would be doing less inside the animal in terms of any sweeping movements of your arm, but potentially you're not going to pick up stage of pregnancy or fetal aging as well as you would with a curvilinear probe. To optimize your image, you can actually change the ultrasound settings on your machine. If in doubt or new to ultrasound, it's a good idea to start with the presets, which often come with the machine, and work from there. The main factor that you would be interested in changing for pregnancy scanning is the depth of which that sound is transmitted or the depth of your image. This should be just below your focal point, so should be landing just below the body of the uterus to capture as much fetal anatomy as possible. You might also be interested in changing the dynamic range or gain of your image. These are some examples of changing dynamic range, gain, and depth. Dynamic range is essentially just the contrast between your shades of grey or the number of shades. In this case, we're actually scanning a human aorta, and we can see that the dynamic range is going up and down and bringing the amount that we can see in that image up and down. As the dynamic range is greatly decreased, we lose the ability to distinguish between the vessel structures and the surrounding tissues. Gain, simply put, is basically just the brightness of your image. Just like dynamic range, it's used to allow you to identify structures with more accuracy. You can overgain, in which case an image can appear washed out or too white, whereas having too little gain can mean that you can't distinguish between things like vessels, bone, fluid, and tissue. As mentioned, your depth should be just below your focal point, allowing you to capture as much of the image as possible without compromising on image quality. A good rule of thumb for playing around with your dynamic range and gain is that your fluid-filled structures should be black, whereas structures like bone should be white, and then everything in between, so maternal structures, placentomes, placental tissue, should be different shades of grey.